January 17th, 1945. On a piece of paper moving through Allied headquarters that day, command of the United States First Army, 3 Corps, roughly 15 divisions, a force that had spent the last 4 weeks fighting under a British field marshal, passes back into American hands. No parade marked it. No press conference announced it. Not this time. But the men who had spent a month watching their own army report to Bernard Montgomery instead of to one of their own knew exactly what that piece of paper meant. We're going to tell you everything about how those soldiers ended up under British command in the first place, and why getting them back became one of the tensest command disputes of the entire war in the West. But I have to warn you that some of what follows will complicate the version of this story you already know. Now, if you're still here, let's start with the night everything about the Allied chain of command in Europe briefly stopped making sense. Part 1. To understand why a routine wartime command reshuffle turned into one of the tensest disputes of the entire Western campaign, it helps to know that Montgomery and Eisenhower had already fought this argument once before, 4 months earlier, and that neither side had really let it go. In September 1944, fresh off the Allied breakout from Normandy, Montgomery pushed hard for a single concentrated thrust across the Rhine under his own command, arguing it could reach Berlin and end the war before the year was out, a plan that would have meant stopping Patton's Third Army in its tracks to free up fuel and supplies for Montgomery's own advance. Eisenhower rejected it on September 17th, insisting that opening the port of Antwerp came first, and that the broader, multi-army advance he favored was the only realistic path forward. The disagreement turned personal 7 days earlier at a meeting on a Brussels airfield, when Montgomery told Eisenhower his directives were nothing but balls, sheer balls, rubbish, a level of insubordination almost no other Allied officer would have risked. Eisenhower's reply has survived as one of the more quietly devastating lines of the entire war. "Steady, Monty," he said. "You can't speak to me like that. I'm your boss." Montgomery, by most accounts, actually apologized on the spot, but the resentment underneath the argument never really went away. Montgomery remained convinced Eisenhower's caution had cost the Allies a faster victory, and that conviction was still sitting there, unresolved, when the Ardennes crisis handed Montgomery temporary command of 2 American armies 3 months later, a turn of events that looked to Montgomery like vindication and looked to Bradley and Patton like the British finally getting the single command Montgomery had wanted all along. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched the Ardennes offensive, and within 4 days the German advance had done something no one at Supreme Headquarters had planned for. It had physically cut the American front in 2. Germany had committed something close to 250,000 men to the attack, organized into 3 armies: Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army in the north, Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army in the center, and Erich Brandenberger's 7th Army covering the southern flank, roughly 14 infantry divisions and 5 panzer divisions in total, thrown against an American defense that, in the opening hours, numbered only around 80,000 men across the sector actually hit. Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters sat in Luxembourg, south of the German penetration, while General Courtney Hodges's 1st Army and General William Simpson's 9th Army found themselves north of the Bulge, their telephone lines to Bradley's own headquarters running straight through territory German tanks now controlled. For a stretch of more than 48 hours, Bradley effectively had no reliable communication with 2 of his own armies at all, at the exact moment those armies needed direction the most, leaving him, in the judgment of historians who have studied the command breakdown since, in no real position to influence the outcome or even confirm to Eisenhower that Hodges had the situation under control. On December 20th, 1944, Dwight Eisenhower made the call, in both senses of that phrase, over the telephone rather than in a face-to-face meeting. He placed 1st Army and 9th Army under the temporary operational command of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group, the British and Canadian force fighting immediately to the north. It was a decision made almost entirely on geography and communications, rather than any judgment about which nationality deserved to command which soldiers. Montgomery could actually reach Hodges and Simpson by telephone. Bradley, for the moment, could not. At the instant of that transfer, 1st Army alone fielded 3 corps and roughly 15 divisions, and 9th Army added 2 more corps on top of that, putting something in the neighborhood of 200,000 American soldiers, and by some counts, considerably more once every supporting unit is added into the count, under a British commander's direct operational control for the first time in the entire European campaign. Part 2. What Montgomery actually did with that command produced almost immediate friction on the American side. Some of it fair criticism, some of it simple wounded pride. And it is worth being honest about both. Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's own chief of staff, privately described Hodges around this period as the weakest commander in the American Army, a blunt internal assessment tied to real reports that Hodges was exhausted, possibly seriously unwell, during the worst days of the German attack. Accounts of exactly what was wrong with him differ, one aide describing something close to viral pneumonia, another disputing that characterization entirely. But the reports were serious enough that they fed directly into Eisenhower's decision to reorganize command in the first place. What did not happen, despite the reorganization, was Hodges losing his job. He stayed in command of First Army throughout the entire period it answered to Montgomery, doing the actual fighting while a British headquarters directed the broader shape of the battle above him. Montgomery's own conduct of the counterattack from the north became the second, sharper source of American frustration. Eisenhower wanted Montgomery's forces attacking south to help close the Bulge by January 1, 1945. Montgomery delayed the attack until January 3rd, citing unprepared infantry and difficult snow conditions, a decision that may well have been militarily sound, but that read, from Bradley's and Patton's side of the map, as excessive caution at exactly the moment speed mattered most. When it finally launched, the attack fell to 7th Corps under Major General J. Lawton Collins, reinforced to something close to 100,000 men, including the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions and the 75th, 83rd, and 84th Infantry Divisions, all aimed at the town of Houffalize, where 1st Army was meant to meet 3rd Army coming up from the south. The conditions were brutal even by Ardennes standards, sleet and rain that froze solid on the roads overnight, followed by snowstorms deep enough to slow an armored division to a crawl, against German defenders who had traded open battle for extensive minefields and small, sharp ambushes. Progress was described at the time as snail-like. The 2nd Armored Division alone took nearly 1,200 casualties over the following 2 weeks, and the 11th Armored Division lost 32 tanks and took over 400 casualties in just 4 days of fighting in the second week of January. Patton's own diary from this period does not hide his frustration. On December 27th, writing about Eisenhower's handling of the crisis compared to Montgomery's, Patton recorded that he wished Eisenhower were more of a gambler, but that Eisenhower was certainly a lion compared to Montgomery, whom Patton described bluntly as a tired little fart, adding that war requires the taking of risks and that Montgomery simply would not take them. Patton went further still, arguing that if Montgomery had attacked with the aggression the moment demanded, the Allies could have trapped and destroyed the entire German force still sitting inside the Bulge, rather than merely pushing it back. First Army and Third Army, coming from north and south respectively, finally linked up at the town of Houffalize on January 16, 1945, closing the Bulge for good, but by American reckoning, weeks later, and with far more of the German attacking force escaping east than a faster link-up might have allowed. If this story is landing the way it should, hit the like button right now. It helps us keep making videos like this one. Part 3. While the actual fighting ground on through late December, a second and considerably more dangerous crisis was unfolding almost entirely behind closed doors, one that had nothing to do with tactics, and everything to do with who would actually run the entire Western Front going forward. Montgomery, through his own chief of staff, Major General Freddie de Guingen, began pushing Eisenhower's headquarters hard for the appointment of a single overall ground forces commander for the whole theater, a title that, given who was proposing it, and given Montgomery's own temporary command of 2 American armies at that exact moment, could only realistically have meant Montgomery himself. De Guingen himself is worth pausing on, because he is the reason this entire crisis did not end considerably worse than it did. He had served as Montgomery's chief of staff since 1942, through North Africa and Normandy and into the Ardennes, and his real value was never as a tactician. It was as the one man capable of translating Montgomery's bluntness into language American headquarters could accept without feeling insulted by it. Bradley himself later credited good old cheerful Freddie with repeatedly smoothing over frictions Montgomery's own aloofness had caused, and Eisenhower's own memoir singles him out with genuine warmth, crediting him with living the code of the Allies in a way few other officers on either side of the alliance managed. Montgomery leaned on him precisely because Montgomery himself lacked the temperament to do that translation work on his own behalf. Eisenhower's patience broke on December 30th, 1944. He drafted a letter to Montgomery warning that if the pressure campaign continued, he would refer the entire command dispute to the combined chiefs of staff, the Anglo-American body that stood above even Eisenhower's own authority. An ultimatum with a real possibility that it would end in either Eisenhower's own resignation as Supreme Commander or Montgomery's removal from his post. An outcome that would have detonated through the Allied command structure in the middle of an active battle. De Guingamp saw the draft before it was sent and understood immediately how serious the moment had become. He rushed to warn Montgomery directly, and when Montgomery learned that Field Marshal Harold Alexander was already being quietly discussed in some quarters as his potential replacement, the Field Marshal's tone changed within hours. De Guingamp drafted an apologetic letter on Montgomery's behalf, walking the demand for a single ground commander back entirely, and the crisis that could have ended one or both men's careers in the middle of the war's largest Western battle simply evaporated, mostly on paper, mostly through one staff officer's intervention. Part 4. Command tensions might have stayed a private, internal matter, resolved quietly through letters between headquarters, if the two men at the center of this story had not been such fundamentally different public figures to begin with. Bradley had built his entire wartime reputation on being the plain-spoken GI's general, publicly self-effacing, a commander American war correspondents liked precisely because he did not perform for them. Montgomery was the opposite kind of public figure, almost by design, theatrical, certain of his own genius, comfortable holding a room's attention for as long as he wanted it. American wire coverage at the time captured the gap in a single unflattering line, describing Montgomery to American readers as the cocky little field marshal who won his reputation in the Libyan campaign, hardly the language of an ally being given the benefit of the doubt. That contrast detonated for real on January 7, 1945, when Montgomery walked into a press conference and said, out loud, in front of journalists, roughly the version of events that had already alarmed Eisenhower in private. Speaking for close to an hour without notes, Montgomery described the battle as one of the most interesting and trickiest he had ever handled, framed his own intervention in terms that emphasized his personal foresight and his own steps to secure the Meuse River line, and gave what read to American ears as strikingly thin credit to the American soldiers who had done the overwhelming majority of the fighting and the overwhelming majority of the dying in the battle that press conference was ostensibly about. This despite including some genuine praise for Eisenhower and for American troops buried inside the same remarks. The reaction on the American side was immediate, and it went all the way to the top. Eisenhower later wrote that the press conference caused him more distress than any similar incident of the entire war. Bradley, writing about it afterward, said Montgomery could not resist the chance to tweak American noses, a mild phrase covering what was, by every account, genuine fury inside Bradley's own headquarters. According to Bradley's own later telling, he went to Eisenhower directly and said, in essence, that he could not be responsible to the American people if arrangements like the one that had just embarrassed the entire American army in the press were allowed to continue, using the word resign in that conversation. Eisenhower's reported reply, that Bradley's resignation would mean absolutely nothing to the actual course of the war, is preserved only in Bradley's own account rather than independently corroborated elsewhere, worth flagging honestly rather than repeating as an unquestioned transcript. What is not in dispute is that the press conference blew a private staff dispute into a public one, and that it did so at the worst possible moment for anyone hoping to keep the American command happy about British officers directing American soldiers. 2 days later, on January 9th, Bradley issued his own press statement in response, unauthorized by Eisenhower's headquarters and, by every account, heavily and pointedly anti-Montgomery in tone, the plain-spoken general abandoning his usual restraint specifically because the provocation had been aimed at his own soldiers. Historians who have traced the relationship between the two men afterward describe Bradley's private feelings toward Montgomery by this point as having hardened from simple professional contempt into something closer to active hatred, a shift that outlasted the war itself. The political fallout reached all the way to London. Winston Churchill himself stood up in the House of Commons on January 18, 1945, specifically to correct the impression Montgomery's press conference had left. His words survive verbatim in the official record. He told the House that he had seen it suggested the battle raging since December 16th was an Anglo-American battle, but that in fact the United States troops had done almost all the fighting and suffered almost all the losses. That the Americans had engaged 30 or 40 men for every one Britain had engaged, and had lost 60 to 80 men for every one of Britain's own. Care must be taken, he told Parliament, in telling the proud tale of this battle, not to claim for the British Army an undue share of what was undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and would, he believed, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. It was, in effect, a sitting British Prime Minister standing in front of his own Parliament to correct his own Field Marshal's public framing, in order to keep the alliance from fracturing over a question of credit. Part 5. The actual paperwork that returned First Army to Bradley's command had already been decided in principle before the press conference ever happened, part of Eisenhower's original plan from late December to hand the army back once the Ardennes salient was fully reduced. But the political temperature the press conference generated made the timing of that handover considerably more loaded than a routine administrative correction. On January 17, 1945, First Army's command reverted from Montgomery's 21st Army Group back to Bradley's 12th Army Group, the same 3 corps and roughly 15 divisions that had gone north under British direction a month earlier, returning, on paper, to an American headquarters. Ninth Army, notably, did not go with it immediately, remaining under Montgomery's command for weeks longer to support the drive toward the Rhine, a detail that undercuts any version of this story that frames the January 17th handover as a total, clean severance between American soldiers and British command. It was a partial correction, aimed specifically at the army whose transfer had generated the most friction, rather than a wholesale reversal of the entire arrangement Eisenhower had built during the crisis. The reason it was First Army and not Ninth Army that came back first is its own small, telling detail. William Simpson, commanding Ninth Army, had built a genuinely cordial working relationship with Montgomery over the same month that Hodges and First Army were straining under him. Montgomery reportedly arrived skeptical of Simpson and warmed to him quickly, in part because Simpson simply let Montgomery run the operational picture without a fight. Bradley himself later contrasted his own uncommonly smooth Ninth Army staff against a First Army headquarters he described as considerably more shaken and in need of steadying during the worst of the crisis. That difference in temperament, as much as any Rhine-crossing planning consideration, is part of why Ninth Army stayed under Montgomery for weeks after First Army had already gone home. Part 6. The damage to Montgomery's standing with his American counterparts outlasted the Ardennes by months, and historians who study the alliance's internal politics generally treat this episode as the high watermark of Anglo-American command friction in the entire European campaign. It hardened American distrust of Montgomery specifically, as an individual officer, rather than souring American commanders on British forces or British leadership more broadly, a distinction Bradley and Patton both seem to have drawn clearly in their own writing. That distrust had a direct practical consequence that spring. When the question of a unified ground commander for the final drive into Germany came up again, the same proposal Montgomery and de Guingand had pushed so hard for in December, Eisenhower refused it again. And this time, there was no serious internal debate about whether he might change his mind. The January crisis had already answered that question as far as the American side of the alliance was concerned. Montgomery himself, writing his own memoirs more than a decade later, did not try to defend the press conference that had done so much of the damage. He conceded plainly that he should never have held it, adding that American feeling against him had grown so strong by that point that almost anything he said in public was bound to be received badly, regardless of its content. It is a rare moment of a famously self-assured commander admitting, in his own hand, that the substance of what he had done in the Ardennes was one thing, and the way he had chosen to describe it publicly was another, and that the second mistake had cost him considerably more than the first ever could have. The verdict. Why did Bradley end up taking a couple 100,000 American soldiers back from Montgomery's command? Not because of a single dramatic confrontation, and not simply because the emergency that justified the original transfer had passed, though that mattered too. It happened because a wartime command decision made purely on the practical grounds of broken telephone lines turned, over the following month, into a referendum on national pride, personal credit, and the difference between a British and an American style of command. And because Montgomery's own public description of his role in the battle made a quiet, planned handover impossible to execute as anything other than a visible, symbolic correction. Eisenhower had already decided to give the army back before Montgomery ever stepped in front of a microphone. What the press conference changed was not the decision itself, but what that decision was forced to mean to everyone watching it happen. They remember Hodges, exhausted and reporting to a foreign headquarters through no failure of his own, staying at his post through all of it. They remember Patton's diary, blunt and furious, timing a British general's caution against every hour the German army spent escaping east instead of being trapped. They remember a letter Eisenhower drafted and never sent, an ultimatum that could have ended 2 careers, quietly withdrawn by one staff officer's intervention before anyone outside a handful of headquarters tents ever knew it existed. And they remember a single press conference, 17 days after the crisis began, turning a private and largely resolved command dispute into the loudest argument of the entire Western campaign about who, exactly, had actually won. Now you know what was in the file. Did your father or grandfather serve in the 1st Army or 9th Army during the winter of 1944 and 1945? Tell us his name and unit in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that were never supposed to reach you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching.